Olá, bem-vindas e bem-vindos, um bom dia a todos. Eu sou Denise Barbosa e estamos aqui mais uma vez para o McKinsey Talks, que já se consolidou como um espaço para conversas ao vivo sobre temas relevantes para a agenda de negócios. E o tema de hoje é o novo modelo de criação de valor para as empresas de bens de consumo. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting Jessica Moulton. Jessica is a senior partner at McKinsey in London and is the leader of McKinsey Retail and Consumer Packaged Goods Practice in United Kingdom and Ireland, and has worked with many consumer-facing companies to strengthen their strategies, pursue growth and cost reduction, and boost the effectiveness of their marketing and sales. Hi, Jessica.
Hi, good morning.
Morning. And also we have here Sid Ramtri, an associate partner at McKinsey in São Paulo. Sid is a member of the McKinsey Consumer Packaged Goods and Retail Practice in Latin America, focusing on innovation and strategy topics. Hi, Sid, good morning.
Hello, good morning.
Vai lembrar a vocês de casa que vocês podem mandar perguntas a qualquer momento durante a nossa sessão, utilizando o campo que fica à direita da tela ou embaixo no celular. Por favor, contribuam, a participação de vocês é fundamental. E como vocês viram, a sessão de hoje vai ser em inglês. Today's session will be in English. Let's get going, shall we? Sid, the floor is yours.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Jessica, at the outset, obviously, thank you for joining us for today's session. And I'll kick off with my first question, right? The very fact that we happen to be talking about a new model for value creation in consumer goods obviously indicates that something seems to have gone wrong with the old model. So one foundational question, right? What is the old model that was in play in the consumer and packaged goods industry?
Fantastic. Thanks, Sid. Well, what's unusual about the consumer goods industry is that it's an industry that has been using this common model for a very long time. In fact, about 50 years. The core way that consumer goods companies work was formed essentially in the 1950s and hasn't changed too much since that time. And we think about it having 5 elements. The first is that it's about mass market brand building, which lets branded players often have gross margins that are about 25% higher than their private label alternatives. The second is about close partnerships with grocery, which gave CPG players a lot of advantage distribution and also helped them grow as modern trade grocers grew around the world. The third is building brands and distributing through developing markets, which was about 75% of growth over the last few decades, and it will be over the next decades as well. Next in line was using an operating model that was increasingly driving costs out of the system. And the consumer goods industry has been very good at continuing to drive down SG&A, over the last several years. And then finally, this model was about using M&A and also divestments in order to keep improving market structure and give new avenues for growth. So that was the old model. It worked really well for a really long time, but it's been faltering. And this slide that we're going to take a look at here shows the extent of the fall. So if we take a look at the economic profit that the industry was generating over the decade from 1994 up to 2009, it was really growing at a really healthy 10%. That dropped all the way down to 3% in the last decade. And then if we take a look at return to shareholders, we see an even greater fall. So this was an industry that was really outperforming, for the previous decade. Over the last, it's actually started to underperform the S&P 500 by 3%. COVID has actually accelerated that decline. So the industry is underperforming more than it was, over the course of the last 10 years.
Let's talk a bit about these trends, right? Because it seems like there's a lot that's changed. So the question is, what exactly has changed, right? And how do we sort of see the pandemic itself having perhaps accelerated or changed the dynamic even further?
Great. Well, let's take a look at the page we have on this, Sid. So we like to think about trends in the context of an industry's business model. And I just talked about this old value creation model in CPG, which you see down the left-hand side of the page. So you'll see here again, the mass market brand building, the partnership with grocers. And the challenge we have in the CPG industry today is that these 12 trends are sitting right on top of that old model and challenging it. Most of the trends are about the first 2 factors in the old value creation model. And I'll walk through these quickly. We'll talk about them in more detail as the conversation proceeds. So the first one, the obvious one is digital ubiquity, where we have a real sea change underway in the way consumers learn about brands, the way they engage with them. And this is something that over the last 10 years has been growing, but now is really turbocharged. And you'll see in the middle of our trend impact. We think the other thing about trend thinking is that it's really important to understand trend strength. And we think this is one where the trend strength is only going to increase. The next is the importance of value and price sensitivity, which has really skyrocketed during COVID. Then we have the millennial and Gen Z effect. And we know that younger consumers really are very different than the older generation in many ways. That's also accelerating. And then we've got the trend of conscious eating and living, where we have in particular a real rise in plant-based. It's been a trend now recently building in Brazil, whereas Brazil was maybe a bit behind on this trend in previous years. And then we have the explosion of small brands, where in many categories, younger brands have managed to adopt the brand values of the younger generations better than some of the older, longer standing brands. They've also been able to get distribution more easily than they used to because of all the new channels out there. And so a lot of them have been thriving and putting the big brands under pressure. That brings us to the next segment, which is the trends that are really sitting on top of CPG's historic focus on partnering with grocers. And the first here is the meteoric rise of the e-marketplaces. Globally, the e-marketplaces pre-COVID were growing at 26%, whereas grocery was growing at just 0.8%. So a real sea change in where consumers purchase things from. Less developed in CPG than in some other categories like books or electronics, but really growing and growing fast, especially during the pandemic. Then we've got the steady rise of discounters, where the discounter business model just obviously has a role in most markets. Got a steady success of these players, starting in Germany, but now successful in many other markets. And these two lead to a mass merchant squeeze, which is our way of talking about how the grocers feel under a lot of pressure and are therefore pushing their manufacturing partners on price and other aspects of their trade negotiations in a more aggressive way than they used to. And then on number 9, we have a lot of food service challenges, of course, during the pandemic. Many markets have food service industries that are down by, say, 50% generated by the crisis. Then there's a few trends that are relevant for other aspects of the old model. We've got a real battle for emerging Asia. So we've got a lot of global growth concentrated in Asia, and that battle is really accelerating. We've got pressure for profit from activist investors. They were quiet for a little while in 2020, but now they are back. And then we've got rising competition for deals, particularly from private equity firms, many of whom have gotten very serious about consumer. So those are the 12 trends in a nutshell.
Excellent. Perfect. Thank you. I think jumping into one more question, if I may, right? How should we think about this underperformance across the sector? Is it that everyone has lost momentum? Are there any winners at all? How should we be thinking about this?
There are important differences by segment. In particular, beauty, has been in comparatively high growth versus some of the other categories. Beauty's been particularly successful in diversifying into a range of channels and adopting e-commerce. We also see that in the pandemic, a lot of household products companies have done well. They've remained focused on core grocery. Obviously, hygiene-oriented products have been very important at this time. But maybe more so than category splits, the more interesting difference is in small versus large. And what we're taking a look at on this page is analysis from the US market, where we can see that small brands have been taking share during the pandemic in most categories. So it's not true in beverages and it's not true in households, but in other categories, we see that small brands have been doing very well. So that's a continuation of the trend prior to the crisis, where small brands were responsible for essentially all of the growth in the US market. Now, what's maybe important to note about the small brands is that these small brands are not necessarily independents. A lot of them are actually owned by the large FMCGs. And in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of the large FMCGs get very good at acquiring small brands and helping them to thrive with their resources.
Thanks, Jessica. Sid, as we love to say here in Brazil, let's tropicalize the discussion. To what extent has what Jessica described played out in Brazil and the rest of Latin America?
Absolutely. I would argue that the 12 trends that Jessica pointed to have actually all been relevant in Latin America, perhaps with the exception of the battleground for emerging Asia, right? Because a lot of our CPGs in Brazil, across the rest of Spanish-speaking Latin America, happen to be the local versions of the multinationals, alternatively local champions in themselves, right? And their internationalization focus is just not as much on Asia. That being said, I think if we were to think about, the pressures with respect to a changing consumer, rising digital expectations, the mass merchant squeeze, the desire for the retail, the grocery industry to try and pull as much to its side as possible, all of those things have absolutely played out in our part of the world, right? Without question. Think about the fact that the Brazilian consumer has been digitally progressive for a very, very long time, very open to experimentation. Younger generations, by way of example, even in our latest consumer sentiment work, point to a willingness to experiment with new kinds of products invariably, right? And I would actually argue that COVID-19 in many ways has also amplified these trends. If I were to try and go ahead and point to this slide, right? We tried to go ahead and run this exercise to understand how shareholder returns have actually evolved across the consumer retail complex since February 2019. Really tracking it all the way up to, let us say, a more current time, right? Up to February 2021. Obviously, the pandemic itself weighs very heavily, right? But you can see that there's obviously a gradual improvement in performance, right? But on the whole, just given the nature of the pandemic in Brazil, right? The performance picture has actually been quite tough. What you see, however, if we move to the next page, and if you try and go ahead and look at this on a sector by sector basis, right? You start to see the length of the bars, and you start to realize that there is absolutely potential for certain players to win over others, right? And I think one of the big things over here is to basically ask ourselves, which CPGs happen to sort of be able to read some of these trends as they start to hit as quickly and effectively as possible, and which ones have really made themselves capable and able, maybe frankly with investments that have been going back even 4 and 5 years before the pandemic, to make themselves more agile, more digital, more nimble, more able to sort of respond to these changing trends, right? And I think we've seen a lot of this go ahead and play out over the course of the pandemic. Let me give you an example, for instance, about the meteoric rise in e-commerce that we have seen across all types of retail in Brazil, but obviously grocery as well, right? Players able to invest in D2C capabilities, especially of their own, right, have actually been able to go ahead and deliver, much greater value to consumers and actually be able to hold themselves far better during the pandemic. I think about Ambev, for instance, right? The Brazilian, the Latin American subsidiary of ABI. In Brazil, they have their direct-to-consumer delivery app. They did 1.5 million deliveries in the year 2019. And in 2020, that number skyrocketed to 27 million, right? And they directly go ahead and cite this as being a very, very important driver of what they were actually able to achieve from a volume perspective. I think the other interesting theme that's coming out with CPGs is the need, especially given the fragmented nature of the trade in Brazil, is to try and actually maintain a very close relationship as far as possible with your end retailers, with your distributors, right? If you would again think about the beverages space, there's been a need to go ahead and extend all sorts of support, right? I mean, ABI, for instance, in Brazil has had a B2B platform that they use to not only go ahead and sell their own products, but they also go ahead and basically make products from other companies available in a marketplace model. So being able to sort of like own a part of that entire marketplace value creation story has been an important driver of outperformance for some companies. Even in such cases, the ability to go ahead and extend credit mechanisms, right, in the form of loans and support programs to bars and restaurants that happen to be so important in the context of the beverages industry has actually been incredibly helpful, right? Digital in that sense and get themselves ready are the ones that actually happen to be outperforming in that regard.
Okay, cool, got it. Jessica, turn it back to you. What is it going to take for CPGs to return to the days of robust value creation?
Well, we think that the extent of disruption is so high that it means we really need to be thinking about a new model for the industry. So out with the old model that worked for 50 years in with a new model that is really drawing on all the trends of the 2020s. This page takes a look at what we think that model is in its essence. It starts in the upper left here with relevance-led brand building, innovation, and marketing. That's a big departure from the mass marketing that most CPGs relied on. This is about brilliant digital marketing to reach consumers with messages that's really relevant for them. It's also about getting more specific about niches of consumers and what specifically they are interested in, which means that CPGs need to be better at handling complexity, rather than a very narrow number of brands and SKUs. The second one on the left is partnering with all growing channels, reducing the historic reliance on grocery. So grocery will remain the most important channel, but other channels are also critical. And sometimes in other channels, players need slightly different products, extending their product line into new areas and really embracing digital sales as they do this. So a lot of this is about actually taking advantage of digital when it comes to how you sell into the fragmented trade, how you work with your key accounts. The next is evolving the operating model in order to be great at local consumer closeness, while also continuing on the requirement for continued productivity. Every company needs to be on an annual productivity journey, but some CPGs really got away from consumer closeness through their operating model changes, which were becoming increasingly centralized. And we think the pendulum has definitely swung back towards more local closeness. It's a real migration for a lot of the big CPGs. The next is continuing to build presence in developing markets. So this remains just as probably more important than it ever was for international CPGs. And then finally, using M&A, but also divestments, in order to keep evolving the portfolio. So we have a trend of the last year or so where CPGs are taking some pretty bold moves to divest some of the brands in their holding that no longer fit their core business model, some of the lower growers, some of the off-trend brands. And we think the industry will continue on that path, and that is a very important step to take. Everybody used to be actively managing their portfolio, bringing in more new brands, establishing a greater percentage of their portfolio really focused on the brand values of the 2020s.
Jessica, let's build on some of the points you've made. On the digital sales front, how should CPGs approach marketplaces? The one concern that I've heard from clients is that participating in marketplaces could cannibalize more profitable sales in other channels. How does one avoid it?
Challenge. The profitability challenge for the CPGs is high. The profitability challenge for the e-marketplaces is also high. These business models are really quite challenging. What we see is that some CPGs have figured out how to segment their product offering to a greater degree. So they are offering unique SKUs or packages of SKUs through e-marketplaces, making them distinct from what they are providing to grocers. And in general, CPGs are also getting better at being able to offer unique SKUs to various customers, which is something that every grocer wants. All key accounts want a reason to differentiate. They want something different and special. So we think this is an important skill for CPGs to keep building.
Sid, we are seeing sustainability come into focus in Brazilian customers. How should companies in the space address this point?
I'm glad you asked that question, because I think this topic has kind of been bubbling under in Latin America for the past 2 or 3 years. And I feel like with the pandemic, it's kind of really come into focus, right? And obviously we have global pressures as well. So I'll try and address this question via 2 fronts, right? I think CPGs need to start to recognize, and many of them have already. There's a lot of progress being made across Brazil. There's a lot of progress being made internationally. But it's important to recognize that not only your shareholders, right, but also your consumers have actually sort of like turned the tide in terms of how they think about sustainability and the broader ESG agenda, right? Because you have the environmental imperatives, you have the social imperatives, and then you have questions of governance as well. So I think that's one important thing for them to recognize. The second is the fact that, the days of being able to sort of, like, let us say, run through, a superficial agenda, in a sense, are gone as well, right? There is a need to sort of like look at the entire end to end and ask yourself where the opportunities might lie for you to go ahead and successfully decarbonize your operations, yes, but also think about basically evolving new kinds of products that sort of meet the aspirations of the environmentally conscious consumer, right? And then that basically puts us into discussions around, product design, the kinds of packaging you use. There's a whole gamut of things over there that need to be taken into consideration, right? So those are the two buckets in which I'd sort of go ahead and couch the response. What I will say is the fact that Brazilian companies are already going ahead and making efforts, right? And starting to basically concretize certain initiatives that can help in that regard, right? I think if you were to sort of think about the embrace that's occurred in the proteins industry in Brazil, by way of example, around alternative proteins, and a lot of the marketing and a lot of the messaging is to the effect of basically saying, we recognize that consumers want to have access to different kinds of protein inputs, and that consumers actually recognize that all traditional proteins at times do have a meaningful impact on the environment. That is a positive recognition, right? Is it going to take time for all of this stuff to sort of gain relevance? Yes, of course it will. But I think it is a good move. I'd also argue that small brands have actually done an excellent job, might they be independently owned or owned by the CPGs, in terms of actually pushing forward, right? You do see a flowering of small brands in Brazil that very openly and very admiringly almost sort of communicate their broader environmental purpose, right? They'll go ahead and emphasize the kinds of packaging in which you receive the products if you happen to order it online. They will talk and be far more transparent at any point in time about the kinds of materials that are made, right? And all of this is happening because of consumer demand. I think a lot of our own consumer surveys itself, right, sort of like talk to how there's almost like a recalibration of socioeconomic and environmental expectations on the part of Brazilian consumers. The pandemic's really given people a chance to think a bit more closely and a bit more hardly about how the world is changing and how they sort of need to take a more active role on questions of environmental stewardship. So I think this is absolutely a trend that will continue to develop with time as well.
Thank you, Sid. Jessica, one last question for you on this topic. Adding small brands to the portfolio through M&A seems like an attractive proposition until the struggles of integration become real. How should incumbent CPG manage a small brand post-acquisition?
This is a great question. I think one key is to appreciate where the brand is in its maturity and how further it's got to go to develop the brand before it extends. Because we see a lot of brands move too early. Before the brand has really incubated itself with its core audience, it's suddenly out there offering adjacencies, trying to grow extra fast because of its new ownership. And this is often a mistake. I think a second thing is that a lot of consumer goods players with all good intention end up overwhelming the newly acquired brands with a lot of fantastic training and exposure and additions into the business. It's very important to understand how the various functions in the business are spending their time and to make sure you're not taking them away from those successful uses of their time to too great a degree and too soon. And then the third is to appreciate where the new brands could really benefit from the acquirer's backbone. And there's often a long list. Oftentimes, small brands don't have the legal expertise they wish they did. Many times they've got supply improvements to make. And certainly when it comes to geographic expansion outside of their home market, there's often a tremendous amount of value that the acquirer can offer. But again, maybe not too fast.
Very insightful. Thank you. Jessica, could you tell us about the capabilities that CGPs need to build to successfully implement the playbook you described, and how well equipped are the traditional players in terms of these new capabilities?
Great. Let's take a look at that on the next page. So we've got our new model here on the left-hand side. We think to really live and breathe this new model, CPGs need 16 capabilities, which are a capability build for almost all. Very few really have these capabilities in place today. They're listed down the middle of the page. We appreciate that it's a long list and it can feel like an overwhelming list. And certainly CPGs are in early stages. So when we ask CPG leaders whether or not their organization is building this capability or not today, we get the response you see on the far right. So 40% of CPGs are building a data-driven marketing capability. 40% are working on omnichannel and D2C businesses. 37% are digitizing their route to market. But you'll see a lot of other low numbers on this page. So this says to us that CPGs are early in a transformation, which will probably take, a decade or so to fully bring about. But there's many important, concepts on this page with our 16 capabilities. There's a set around really changing marketing to become relevance-led, and digital, data-driven marketing is sort of the top of that list. There's another set, which is 3 through 6, which are about digitizing the sales channel in various forms, including your question on getting good about e-marketplace management, which is certainly not easy. There's a set around getting better at supporting developing market growth. And then there's a set of back office capabilities around tech and back office, which are also important.
Very interesting, thanks. Sid, where do you believe CPGs in our part of the world are focusing a majority of their capability building?
Absolutely. I think there are a couple of things that have actually been in focus pre-pandemic that have continued on into 2020 and now, right? I think building on what Jessica said, the focus on data-driven marketing, right? Especially trying to think more deeply about personalization, advanced analytics, things of that nature has been hugely in focus. Looking on this list specifically, revenue growth management has been a very, very important driver for many CPGs as well. And frankly, this broader question on how you manage your direct-to-consumer approach, right, in the context of marketplaces has been another focus area. I think, there's been far greater experimentation on the part of CPGs with respect to trying to think through whether subscription programs work for certain kinds of products. How is it that you start to actually, build some of your own last mile capabilities facilitated by partners to make sure you can get products directly in the hands of consumers, and obviously therefore start to get greater, visibility and intelligence on how consumers react and behave, right? As opposed to how things used to work in the old model. So it is really all of that that's actually sort of been in focus. I think what some of the conversations that we're now starting to also have, I would actually argue, is with respect to how, smaller brands and attacker challenger brands can actually be built by CPGs itself, right? I think what we've actually seen in Brazil in some respects is that a lot of the CPGs have not been as active and as quick in certain instances of going ahead and acquiring smaller brands. It's something Jessica talked about from the perspective of global CPGs, but I'd argue in Latin America it's happened with less frequency. So the question that they're contending with is to say, is this a right year in which I could consider M&A selectively? Are small brands in focus? Or alternatively, what's it actually going to take for me to go ahead and build some small disruptive brand of my own, right? I think the other thing that I'd actually argue that's in focus is investing in technology capabilities itself, right? A lot of the focus on IT, a lot of things that are basically the backbone, let us say, of a lot of the digital focused initiatives that happen to be listed on this particular page are the kinds of things that companies are thinking about as well.
Thank you, Sid. Thank you, Jessica. Now I'm going to go to the questions sent by our audience. I have one here. The first one is for you, Jessica. How do you see supply chains evolving post-COVID-19? There is a lot of discussion about localization. How much of it will come true?
Well, I think there's quite a lot of change that's been underway. Many CPGs have been making some pretty fundamental changes to their supply chain. I think it's possible that the longer-term legacy of COVID-19 in the consumer goods industry will be not the consumer behavior changes that stick, but rather all the capability builds that CPGs went on, how they changed their businesses to be fundamentally more digital. And supply chain is one of the items on that list where a lot of CPGs have been making a lot of adjustments. But the Brazilian context is a little different. Sid, I'd be curious what you see in Brazil.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two things that are playing out in Brazil, right? So I think the broader global conversation around, let us say, localization versus globalization happens to be just less relevant in Brazil. We've always sort of historically had a reliance on local inputs, local manufacturing processes for a lot of the stuff that happens to be sold in the country. So that dynamic has not been as relevant. But I think the one that has been relevant is really how you go ahead and manage your relationship with the rest of your supply chain, because the operational strains have been very, very meaningful, especially given how long the pandemic has worn on and with the kind of intensity it has worn on in Brazil. So being able to really support and lift up that entire supply chain in moments like this has been incredibly important. Best practice sharing around operational safety protocols as well, right? And starting to invest in, let us say, greater data transparency across the supply chain. There's going to be interesting conversations, I think, about the apparel industry, right? To basically say, how do I manage between overstocking and understocking by way of example, right? Especially given the fact that, this was an industry that was very, very heavily offline oriented pre-pandemic in Latin America, and now has gone through sort of a bit of a speed e-commerce adoption, right? How do I go ahead and actually sort of like manage all of that in the context of my localized supply chain? There are data questions behind it, right? There's a whole bunch of digital capability building that needs to happen within your own company as a CPG, and obviously then starting to basically facilitate those changes across the rest of the supply chain as well. So I think that's really where we're starting to see, the greatest number of conversations and the greatest amount of focus.
Sure. Sid, another question. Could you tell us how CPGs can incorporate more startup-like culture into their organizations?
So I think a lot of this has to really do with, you could point it down to a completely new way of working that we obviously talk about in the context of Agile. But I think the important thing is to recognize that there's a series of best practices that can be followed, right? And I think the first is to say, you have to start to actually sort of like drive a cultural change in terms of how the process that goes from understanding consumer needs and collecting consumer insights to turning those into ideas, testing those ideas, and eventually launching them off into new products and services actually goes through, right? There needs to be a greater focus on experimentation. There needs to be a greater focus on this idea that you can test and learn and fail, and that's perfectly okay. For me, what's fundamental is that cultural change, right? That's one thing that comes into focus. The second, I would argue, is basically, being able to ensure that you have access to a completely different kind of talent model, right? I think, when you start to look for marketers in your organization, for instance, you need to basically think omni-channel and digital first, right? So do you have the right kinds of talent in terms of folks who know what digital marketing is all about? Do you have people who sort of understand, concepts at the cutting edge of design, right? People who can imagine and reimagine products quickly and successfully, especially as Brazilian consumers become even more and more exposed to ideas and concepts from abroad, right? I think there are lots of these like foundational capabilities that are going to be required, obviously alongside core technology talent as well, right? I think, every conversation you end up having with the CEO, even forget CPGs, right, across the B2C complex, is about how, core IT, core software development, core staff that can go ahead and build apps by way of example, right, that are so important to maintaining a dialogue with consumers is missing, right? So it's incredibly important that we sort of focus on some of these human capital issues as well, such that you're able to infuse the organization with the right kind of talent that's required looking forward.
Jessica, how long do you believe it would take for CPGs to successfully pivot into this model?
I think it's going to be quite a migration. I think it's going to be a decade-long transition. Some of the sectors within CPG will need to be changed faster than others, and they are. So beauty is definitely out in front, given the attention the consumer has to digital, how engaged the consumer is in discovering new brands, sort of driving a lot of the trends in that space. But I think the same kind of changes that we see happening in that space will extend to other aspects of CPG. And so we will be looking at, a fairly different space over, in a decade's time with a transition between now and then.
Okay, thank you, Jessica and Sid, for today's conversation, and to the participants who have contributed with questions to our session. We appreciate you having spent time, having taken the time to be with us this morning. Então, muito obrigada a todo mundo que assistiu e que ficou aqui os últimos 45 minutos com a gente. Para conhecer a agenda completa do McKinsey Talks, vá em mckinseytalks.com. Lá vocês podem assistir aos episódios anteriores e na segunda-feira esse episódio também vai estar lá disponível e vocês também encontram acesso para versões em áudio disponíveis no Spotify. Muito obrigada, bom fim de semana e até sexta-feira que vem. Tchau.